Good morning, everybody. Why don't we go ahead and get started? It's 10 o'clock. I'd like to go ahead and call the meeting to order. And our first agenda item is election of permanent co-chair. Need a motion? Senator Dawson.
I move that Senator Wolfman be chair.
I move that Representative Walt Rogers is chair for the House.
Are there any nominations? Any other nominations? All in favor of those two motions, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Motion approved. Member committee, we have rules in front of us. The next item of business is adoption of the rules. Any questions on the rules or comments at that? Any so moved?
Adoption.
Moved by Dawson. Second by Representative Miller. Discussion. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. The rules are approved. The next item on the agenda is discussion of the charge of the committee. The charge of the committee. The charge of the committee is to monitor the implementation of the limited legalization of use in this state of cannabidiol, to consider whether the new law is helping the people it is supposed to help, and to review the University of Iowa College of Medicine research study called for by the legislation. The charge is basically narrowly focused on trying to make sure the law that we pass is actually doing what it was intended to do, and that's help these families treat their family members. So I think the charge is pretty clear. Are there any questions about the charge? And then we'll move right into the agenda. So I'll go ahead. Before I do, welcome everybody. Welcome everybody for attending the meeting. We're glad to see you, especially the members of the committee for taking the time to be here today. To hear Representative Rogers to talk through how we're doing it, implementing the law, and how we're going to move forward. So welcome and thank you all for being here. I did note there is a sign-up sheet for people that want to address the committee. There are a couple of times today where we're going to hear public comments at 11:30 to 12. It's going to be open for public comments, and then again from 2 to 3 p.m. today. I counted about 23 or 24 people that have already signed up. I haven't done the math on that, but I think we initially thought about 5 minutes per person. I'm wondering if that shouldn't be 3 minutes per person. The committee's feelings on that. I'd like to hear from as many people as we can. So if that's okay. If you've signed up, we'd like you to try to hold your comments approximately 3 minutes. And if you plan to sign up, the same. I apologize for people that might have hear more than 3 minutes. I have a brief statement that I'll do now. When Iowa moms whose children have serious life-threatening conditions learn that families in more than 20 other states are being helped by a new medicine, they asked Iowa's representatives for help. When Republicans and Democratic lawmakers and Governor Branstad learned about the heartbreaking struggles of innocent kids suffering from uncontrolled seizures, almost all of us voted to provide legal, affordable access to medicine that would help. It's worth remembering that Senate File 2360 was approved by large bipartisan majorities in the Iowa Senate, 38-8, and the Iowa House, 77-20. A month later, it was signed into law by Governor Branstad at a large public ceremony here at the State House on May 30th. The passage of Senate File 2360 was rightly hailed at that time as a bipartisan success, an example of putting people ahead of our political differences. Today, this committee's official language, the committee's official charge is to consider whether the new law is helping the people it's supposed to help. Qualified Iowans will, with the support of their doctors, soon have a card allowing them to possess up to 32 ounces of cannabidiol, a non-intoxicating oil made from cannabis, a plant also known known as marijuana. But having that card doesn't mean Iowa families will have the medicine they need. There are severe legal risks and significant financial barriers preventing Iowa families from getting the medicine they need, the very medicine that a very large bipartisan majority of both the Iowa House and the Senate voted to make available. I have a handout that I'd like to share with the committee that our staff put together that describes some of the issues that citizens would have to deal with regarding the issue of breaking other states' laws in order to get the medicine they need. This example is an example of a family that might go to Colorado to get the medicine that somebody needs. More than 20 other states have solved these problems by making it possible for their residents to purchase cannabidiol produced in their home state. Iowa can do the same thing in a responsible, regulated way. Today, we should focus on the job given to us by bipartisan majorities of the Iowa House and Senate, and that is to help the families get the medicine they urgently need. So with that, Representative Rogers would like a couple of your comments as well.
Thank you, Senator. I'm Representative Rogers from Cedar Falls, and I just have a few comments. With this bill passed, I look forward to the day. I look forward to listening and learning, and I think I really am in agreement with our charge. And just want to reiterate the fact that what we're here to do today is consider whether this new law is helping the people it's supposed to help. And that's why we're here. And I think we focus on that, focus on those people. I've met with several families, seeing how this potentially could affect and seeing people with intractable epilepsy and the lives that they're leading. And so we're here to help them. So this should be a good day, learning and listening, and I look forward to the process.
Good. Thank you, Representative Rogers. By the way, I'm Joe Volkman. I represent Iowa State, member of the Senate. I think we go around and have members introduce themselves so people know who's on the committee and they're part of the state they represent.
State Representative Flo Bowler, House District 20, which is Southwest Iowa.
Senator Mike Freitag from Northeast Iowa and 4 counties northeastern part of the state. Senator Charles Schneider from Central Iowa. I represent Waukee, Windsor Heights, Clyde, and most of West Des Moines.
Representative John Forbes from Urbandale House District 4.
Representative Bob Kressig from Cedar Falls, House District 59, home of the UNI Panthers, who are in Hawaii today in a play. Kind of cool. Like to be there.
Senator Bill Dotsler, Waterloo, and surrounding communities to the east and south.
Representative Linda Miller, Bettendorf, and Scott County.
Senator Steve Sodders, and Marshall and David County District 30.
Very good. Thank you, members of the committee, for being here today. The first item of business, we're going to hear from Rochelle, who's our senior legal counsel with the Legislative Service Agency, giving us a brief overview of Senate File 2360.
Everybody should have a copy of the legislation, Senate File 2360. I'm going to present a summary of the legislation. My purpose in doing this is to give you the basis, the enabling legislation for the rules that actually was passed and filed on the 9th of September. And Dr. Thompson from the Department of Public Health, as well as representatives from the Department of Transportation, are here to answer more specific questions about those implementation provisions. So we all hopefully have a copy of the legislation that was signed by the governor in May of this year. And this act actually creates what we call the Medical Cannabis Act. It will be codified at Code Chapter 124 once we complete the codification process. This act allows for the medical use of cannabidiol for alleviating symptoms caused by intractable epilepsy. And the act defines cannabidiol to mean a non-psychoactive excuse me, found in certain very specific cannabis plants that are essentially free from plant material and that have a THC level of no more than 3%. Intractable epilepsy is very specifically defined to be an epileptic seizure disorder for which standard medical treatment does not prevent or significantly ameliorate recurring uncontrolled seizures, or for which standard medical treatment results in harmful side effects. Under the legislation, an Iowa licensed neurologist in good standing who has examined and treated a patient suffering from intractable epilepsy may provide, but does not have a duty to provide, a written recommendation for the patient's medical use of cannabidiol to treat or alleviate symptoms of intractable epilepsy. If no other satisfactory alternative treatment options exist for the patient, and if certain conditions are met, those conditions are that the patient must be a permanent resident of the state of Iowa, a neurologist has treated the patient for intractable epilepsy for at least a 6-month period. The treating neurologist has tried alternative treatment options that have not alleviated the patient's symptoms. The neurologist determines the risks of recommending the medical use of cannabidiol are reasonable in light of the potential benefits for the patient, and the neurologist maintains a patient treatment plan. Now, for purposes of the treatment period, the legislation provides that treatment provided by a neurologist may include treatment by an out-of-state licensed neurologist in good standing for that 6-month treatment period. However, the neurologist who writes the recommendation must be an Iowa neurologist. An Iowa neurologist is the only person authorized under the Act to write a recommendation for the use of cannabidiol oil in this state for a patient diagnosed with intractable epilepsy. And any cannabidiol provided pursuant to that neurologist's recommendation shall be obtained from an out-of-state source. So the law does not allow for any in-state production and shall only be recommended for oral or transdermal administration. The Department of Public Health may approve the issuance of a cannabidiol registration card. That issuance is actually by the Department of Transportation. The Department of Public Health receives the necessary documentation and makes the decision as to whether or not to issue that cannabidiol registration card. So a patient must be at least 18 years of age, must be a permanent resident of the state. If they request the patient's neurologist is actually the one who has to submit a written recommendation to the Department of Public Health, indicating that the patient may benefit from the medical use of cannabidiol. And the patient also has to submit a separate application to the Department of Public Health with certain information that will counsel speak very specifically to that unit. The Department of Public Health can also approve a cannabidiol registration card issuance by the Department of Transportation to a primary caregiver who's at least 18 years of age, who requests the patient's neurologist to submit a written recommendation that we talked about, that a patient in the primary caregiver's care may benefit from the medical use of cannabidiol. And that primary caregiver also has to submit an additional application to the Department of Public Health with certain information. Now, the Act defines primary caregiver is as a person who's at least 18, who has been designated by a patient's neurologist or some other person having custody of a patient as being necessary to take responsibility for managing the well-being of the patient with respect to the medical use of cannabidiol pursuant to the Act. The Department of Public Health is required to maintain a confidential file of the names of each patient and primary caregiver who has been issued a registration card. Individual names contained in the file are confidential, are not subject to disclosure except to certain persons, to authorized employees or agents of the Department of Public Health and the Department of Transportation, and to authorized employees of state or local law enforcement officials and agencies for the purpose of, so those agencies can verify that the person is lawfully in possession of a registration card. Release of information is also subject to and must be consistent with HIPAA regulations because this involves medical information. Section 7 of the Act really it does provide the cross immunity and the affirmative and complete defenses in the Act for criminal prosecution in this state, under state law, for neurologists, patients, and primary caregivers who comply with the provisions of the Act. So a neurologist, including any authorized agent of the neurologist, is not subject to prosecution for the unlawful recommendation, possession, or administration of marijuana for activities arising directly out of or directly related to the recreation or use of cannabidiol in the treatment of a patient diagnosed with intractable epilepsy. Similarly, the law provides an affirmative and complete defense to a criminal prosecution for a patient who's been diagnosed with intractable epilepsy, who used or possessed cannabidiol pursuant to a recommendation by a neurologist, and if the patient is 18 years or older, is in possession of a valid cannabidiol registration card. And this defense applies to a patient only if the quality of cannabidiol oil possessed by the patient does not exceed 32 ounces. Similar affirmative defense is available to a person who is a primary caregiver of a patient who has been diagnosed with intractable epilepsy and who has a neurologist's recommendations for the possession and use of the oil, and that primary caregiver has to be in possession of a valid cannabidiol registration card, if that card is again on behalf of the patient and for the patient's use only. Again, this defense applies to a primary caregiver if the quantity of the oil possessed by the primary caregiver does not exceed 32 ounces per patient. The Act does provide that a person who knowingly or intentionally possesses or uses cannabidiol in violation of the Act could be subject to the Iowa's Controlled Substances Act, Chapter 124, as well as Iowa's tax stamps, excise tax on unlawful dealing in certain substances under Code Chapter 453D. Code chapter created by the Act does have a sunset provision. It was repealed officially into legislation on July 1st, 2017. And in addition, the Act requires the University of Iowa College of Medicine and the College of Pharmacy to submit an annual report detailing the scientific literature, studies, and clinical trials regarding the use of cannabidiol on patients diagnosed with intractable epilepsy to the legislature and to the Department of Public Health before July 1st of each year. That hasn't obviously happened yet. That will begin, it's set to begin July 1st of 2015.
Thank you, Rochelle. Are there any questions about Rochelle's presentation on the legislation? We're going to hear from Deborah Thompson next about the rulemaking to implement the law. On behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank Rochelle for all the work she did during the session. She was very involved, hour after hour of the various drafts we went through, and did a terrific job. I'd like to acknowledge that. There are no. Thank you. If there aren't any questions for Rochelle, we'll go on to the next item on the agenda. We're going to hear from Deborah Thompson. She's a policy advisor and Healthy State Initiative Coordinator for the Iowa Department of Public Health, and Ms. Kim Snook, Director of Driver Services with the Iowa DOT. I'd like to invite you to come up to the table. And we're calling Mark Lowe from the Department of Transportation. He's the Director of the Motor Vehicle Division. He's going to join us.
Hi, Mark. Rochelle Nellis with the Legislative Services Agency for the Cannabidiol Implementation Study Committee. Department of Public Health, and so we have Deborah Thompson here and Ms. Kim Snook. We're ready to present.
Great, thank you.
Can you hear okay?
Yes. I will go on mute so that I don't disrupt anything there. So if you're asking something, there's a slight delay, I've been clicking back on mute, okay?
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome, thank you.
Okay, Deborah and Kim, go ahead.
Okay. I want to thank the committee for inviting us to be here today, so we have the opportunity to get you up to speed on what we've been doing to implement the program. Everyone should have this PowerPoint presentation handout to follow along with me and Kim. I'll start with the discussion points that I plan to talk about today. I'm happy to entertain anything else that you don't see on the bullets here. But I thought I would start with a brief overview of the application process and the registration card issuance process, followed by a summary of the promulgation of the administrative rules, discussion of the timeline for implementation, and the additional program activities that we've been working on aside from the rules, and then just a few things that we would suggest you review during session if you choose to. And then I think we'll leave plenty of time for questions and answers. It's up to you guys. I guess it's actually up to the chairs if you'd like to interrupt me while I'm going, or if you choose to wait until after I'm done. I'm comfortable with that either way.
Members of the committee, if you have questions,
So if you'll flip to this flow chart, please. I'll begin there, up at the top. Once the application is available and we're ready to begin that process and we're ready to begin issuing the cards, the application will be posted on the IDPH website at the address below. The patient, parent, or legal guardian will initiate the application process for themselves and for the primary caregivers. So Rochelle went over the requirements that must be met, but so I don't lose my train of thought, I'm going to repeat some of that, so I apologize. But the patient is required to be 18 or older to receive a card. I just want to clear up any confusion that this doesn't mean that the patients under 18 aren't eligible to have the cannabidiol oil. It simply means the card won't be issued to them, it would be issued to a legal guardian or primary care. You have to be a permanent resident of Iowa. You have to have a written recommendation from the treating neurologist here in Iowa. You have to have submitted a completed application to IDPH that you've approved. And of course, you have to have contractable epilepsy as defined by Senate File 2316. After filling out some of the preliminary information that mainly includes contact information and signature and attestation that you've provided true and accurate information to the department, you'll take the application with you to your treating neurologist here in Iowa. The neurologist will provide the written recommendation. The written recommendation is a standard form that is included in the application form. We wanted to make it one big package. There are requirements that must be met in order for the written recommendation to be provided by the neurologist. Again, Rochelle covered those, but I'll repeat them. The patient has to be a permanent resident of Iowa. The neurologist has had to have treated the patient for at least 6 months. This can include out-of-state treatment. Alternative treatment options have had to have been tried by the in-state neurologist. And the treatment plan is required to be maintained. And the neurologist who writes the written recommendation is requested to be available to provide follow-up care and treatment to the patient to determine the efficacy of the protocol. Next, the neurologist will send the then completed application directly to the department. We wanted to ensure that the application doesn't change hands too often. We wanted to marginalize the opportunity for fraudulent behavior with step. So they'll send it directly to us. We'll then verify that the application is complete and that the neurologist is licensed under Iowa Code Chapter 148 and is in good standing with the Iowa Board of Medicine. If the application is denied and it's because something's incomplete, they skipped a step, then we'll call the applicant to request the missing information. We do reserve the right to deny a card for any reason, but there is an appeals process set up in the rules. If and when the application is approved, we will notify the Department of Transportation that the applicant can be issued a medical cannabidiol registration card. The applicant, the primary caregivers, and the neurologist will also receive notification of approval. The patients who are over the age of 18 and the primary caregivers will then be asked to go to their local DOT location to obtain a card. The date of expiration is 1 year from the date of issuance, and the date of issuance is defined as the date you go to the DOT location to be issued the card. And then the renewal process can begin at least 60 days prior to the expiration date. There are a few points that we have on the standout to remember. I think here I feel comfortable just allowing Rochelle's comments to stand. Are there any questions?
Senator Saunders.
And maybe with DOT, has there been any talk about putting a restriction directly on someone's license? Which, not necessarily, you wouldn't necessarily need a whole new car to buy the license. I can go get my license basically with a restriction on the back. Like we do now for all the restrictions.
The thought may have crossed our mind, but because the legislation was specific that the DOT had to issue a physical card, I don't think we spent much time on that.
Physical card is separate from a driver's license.
Yes.
Or an ID card.
Yeah, if I can weigh on that, because I think we, part of the legislative process, and then ultimately rejected in favor of a separate card. So, and I think part of the issue we've had is that people lose their licenses, change their licenses for different reasons, separate from their medical conditions, and they may become eligible or ineligible for the candidatal possession separate from their license. That was one of the reasons that was not pursued.
Representative Rogers. Ms. Thompson, thanks for being here and answering your work. Just a quick question, what do you expect the renewal process to be, how detailed?
That's a fair question, and I can't actually say that we have all those details worked out. We did amend the administrative rules. At first, we thought everybody would just do the same thing they've already done. But we listened to the families, they had concerns about the ease of the renewal process. So what we did was amend the rules to let it be more flexible. Instead of saying you have to start all over the way you did when you first were issued a card, we said you'll fill out a document that we approve. I understand that doesn't give a lot of detail, but we have some time to work on that. So we kind of want to see how it goes. We'll work on the details. We work closely with DOT. They've been a great partner. And we will work with the intent to make it as easy as possible while respecting the program.
Any other questions? Cool, go ahead.
Okay. So moving on to the next slide, I'll begin a discussion of the administrative rules process. Just wanted to help you guys understand the mantras and rules of thumb that we practice as we were promulgating the rules. And essentially, we really wanted to reflect the language provided for in Senate File 2360. It was very detailed. I think we got the message that additional padding, additional things weren't really necessary. So we really focused on clarification, definitions that weren't provided for, and just focused on making the rules tight, the way the legislation was. We also wanted to limit the interference of the government agency in the doctor-patient relationship. I don't know how much more explanation that needs, but that is a private matter, and we didn't feel it would be appropriate to intervene in any of that. We worked very closely with our partners, the Iowa Department of Transportation, and we also collaborated with key stakeholders, people that we identified were following the legislation very closely at the end of session. We did that before the rules were released. Moving on to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about the stakeholder engagement. We had several meetings with the DOT. We continue to talk to them regularly. We held 2 interagency meetings to bring in some of the other state agencies that were also interested in this bill, specifically the Governor's Office of Drug Control Policy, the Department of Public Safety. We invited the Iowa Board of Pharmacy because they have a bit of a history on this topic. DOT was there, and the NPH Assistant Attorney General, who has been instrumental in this, just bless Heather Adams, she's been great. We also sent via email some of the notice rules versions to the Board of Medicine, to legislators and legislative staff. We invited the Iowa Medical Society and the Children's Hospital over to the department for a conversation as well. And then I think really I invited myself to the Iowa Neurological Association's board meeting, but they were gracious enough to allow some time in their agenda for some discussion. We certainly met with the families who have been leading this, the ones that have been up at the Capitol or were at the Capitol the most. And we talked with the Iowa Epilepsy Foundation and also staff from their national. So after we did that, we filed the rules for notice with the Administrative Rules Review Committee. We had a public comment period that ended on August 26th. That date we held a public hearing. We had 7 or 8 ICM locations set up in a conference calling capability. We also had a lot of people come to the department physically. We received 41 written and oral comments from 31 individuals. Several people wrote comments and also provided oral testimony at the public hearing. Most of the comments were outside of the administrative rules. They addressed the Senate file directly. They had some comments about concern on how patients will obtain the oil, and also expressed support for additional medical conditions to be covered by medical marijuana laws in Iowa. Approximately 10 of the comments actually did address the rules. And we did make several changes in response. I'm hitting the highlights here, but I'm happy to go into more details if you'd like. But the changes that we made, we revised the definition of permanent resident. What we did was an unintended consequence. Our definition of permanent resident we created because it wasn't provided for in the Senate file. We had a 90-day requirement and also a requirement that you have a driver's license and a non-operator's ID. What that did, unintentionally, was conflict with the patient definition. So if you 18, you would not have had to go to the DOT for any reason. Your primary caregiver would get the card. However, we accidentally grouped in that population by having the definition of permanent resident say you have to have a driver's license or non-operator's ID. So what we did was remove those requirements. The 90-day requirement came out. You can bring a driver's license or non-operator's ID, but we provided more of a list, like a utility bill, pay stubs, things like that, to accommodate concerns that was too restricted. That aligns better with other agencies, specifically the DOT's residency requirements, DNR for their licenses, DHS, and then the way that some other states have set them up too. So some of the states are a little more lenient on permanent residencies, some of them are more restrictive than we were, so we're kind of getting some spot in the middle.
We have a question, Representative Bach.
Thank you for being here. The next point you have is ineligibility. Could you explain that in somewhat detail?
Sure. Actually, I'll probably defer, but what the representative is talking about is under our requirements for showing, solidifying your identity. We said you have to have a driver's license or a non-operator's ID. There may be a very small minimal population that are not eligible for either one of those. We added a mechanism that they could go through working with the DOT to verify the identity. I'm not the expert there, so I'll defer to Margaret Kim to explain the challenge.
We do have exceptions process in place. So when those situations would come up, which we do think would be very few, where they don't meet those requirements, that we would work with them to see what they need to have. We do want to keep the criteria as close as we can with our security and our identification, because what we issue is an identification or a license. So we certainly want to maintain our identification process, but we do currently, even with regular licenses, make these have an exception process.
Could you describe one of these individuals as to
I did it with the ineligible.
For a caregiver
or a driver's license or a non-operator's ID?
If they were not eligible, say if there was a driver's license, they could be under suspension or something.
I understand that.
For an ID?
But they've already had the driver's license.
Right.
Okay.
So that part would be, they wouldn't get a driver's license. For identification, if they've already provided something like that, had an license, that would be suspension or something, then we could issue an ID in those cases.
Kim, if I can weigh in for a second too, I think part of what Representative Bob is getting to is some of the circumstances we have, particularly, it's becoming less and less, I would advocate, as our population base is shifting into what I call the more modern world of birth records. But we have had people on occasion over the years that have had difficulty establishing a birth record because of the time in which the birth records were established and some of the vagaries of how those were kept. And you and our investigator staff had to work with them to kind of vet their identity with the understanding that some of the documentation wasn't there. I know the sort of the colloquial way we talk about it is none seem to deal with this, as you discussed. Maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit.
Would these be elderly people?
Yes, currently we have people that were born in homes and things like that, and those are the exception processes that we use right now for those. They'll bring their Bibles in, they'll bring other type of information that we actually review information based on.
I think too, Kim, the other area that sometimes have to work with folks is particularly women that have to document name changes, and sometimes the records are not immediately available or a long time coming. We're able to work with them on a temporary basis to get an ID started for them, and then come back as they're able to gather remaining documents. That's a fairly accurate way to describe that.
And adoption situations. We work with
yeah.
farm coding and vital services.
Okay, with the recent ones, or the more recent ones, the foreigners,
Certainly, yes, we have certain requirements there for national documentation that we work with SAVE. We have, we check different places automatically that we can maintain if they don't have the proper documentation. We actually make contacts with the federal government to verify the information for what's needed to create an identification.
Yeah, and I think an important point to make here too is our statutes do require authorized presence, and so that authorized presence is something that we have to document through, documentation by USCIS, and that we verify through the state program, and that can be both permanent residents and temporary residents. So, according to our statutory procedures, if you're temporarily authorized to be present in the country, we can issue a driver's license for ID to that person, but no longer than 2 years and no longer than the term of their authorized stay. So, there's some specific rules for folks that are permanent temporary foreign nationals.
thank you, and appreciate both of you. Thank you.
If there are no other questions, I'll continue on to the next slide that says time frame for implementation. Excuse me. So the effective date of the rule will be January 30, 2015. And the notice rules, they were in November, but we thought it would be less confusing to not have too many competing dates out there. The January 30 date represents a closer alignment of all of the moving parts for this new program coming together. It's not necessarily the date we will begin accepting applications, but it does get us closer to the time frame that the DOT will be ready to issue the cards based on their working with their vendor for the programming efforts and upgrades. The Administrative Rules Review Committee met on Tuesday and approved, I guess, didn't delay, maybe is a better way to say it, our notice rules. Yesterday, the State Board of Health, which is our governing body, approved our adopted and filed version of the rules. So it was interesting how the dates sort of came together that way, but what they adopted yesterday is what is now filed with the Administrative Rules Committee as our adopted and filed version. Does that make sense? Okay. And again, the applications will be posted online when all pieces are in place and ready to go.
Representative Cressy.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming today to address this issue. I know that when we were in the legislative process on this bill, had some discussions with DOT, and they anticipated that, the bill was signed by the governor, came law July 1, and they anticipated that they would have a process for people that are in need of this sometime in September. Now I'm seeing it's January 30 of 15. Can you give me reasons? I know it sounds like it was kind of a bureaucratic nightmare. Would that be the description to you?
I'm not going to call it a bureaucratic
Yeah.
nightmare, but Mark, if you'd like to chime in, go ahead.
Yeah, if I can chime in that, I know we were trying to anticipate, we're working with our card vendor on how much time would it take, because there's a number of programming steps that have to happen for us to be able to capture the information, apply it to a new card type, have that card type go through the issuing process, the factory be produced correctly, and that type of thing. There was about a 4-month window, so assuming that we could get started as soon as possible. I think that's probably where September, I don't think we said September, I think we were talking about how much programming time it would take and that type of thing, but, or if it got formed that way, we did have been mistaken, our partners definitely say September, but as we started working through the process, we started immediately working on the rules to figure out what was the process, what would the card requirements be, that type of thing. And there was a realization that we needed to get rules in place for the program started, so that we know we were programming the right thing, if that makes sense. I think the other thing that came into play was there's an expense from our vendor to produce that. And one of the issues we ran into is the road use tax funds are constitutionally protected. They related to drivers and roads, and there was some certain figure out how to use non-local use tax funds to pay for that. So as we work through that, we work with the state CIO, we resource technology fund to take care of that. That's coming together now. So we're actually at the point where we have the rules in place. We think there's funding in place. We can execute our statement of work to get started with our vendor. We'll then go through a process of programming, development, and testing so that we're able to produce the card, which we think will take about 4 months. And so that's what's starting to align with around that January 30th.
I think it's also worth pointing out that emergency rulemaking authority was not authorized in the legislation. It was always going to be.
Representative Chris.
Yeah, was there any discussion when you had conversations with the agencies to look at a temporary card process that, because I don't know what the real numbers are of people that suffer with this disease. Thankfully, it's not a lot. But would that have been a process that we could have looked at and said, you know, we have the neurologists that have identified these people that have these significant needs with this intractable epilepsy. Could we have not done a temporary card process to help them deal with this issue and then move forward with a proposal that made it a long-term process? Was that ever discussed?
That's a fair question. We did discuss that. However, what we tried to do was balance all of the interests involved.
In the language of the bill, there was a provision for issuance of temporary cards, and it was taken out of the bill. Okay, so I wonder if the question, so you don't need to take a heed of that. Is there any provision? Do you believe you have any authority to issue temporary cards in that?
We decided we did not have the express authority needed.
Yeah, and if I could weigh in on that at this moment too, with that coming out and with what seemed to be the intent of the legislation of us issuing a secure card, we did bounce around the ideas of how can we get the factory this card, what level of security this card has to have. Could we issue something much more like the employee ID card that we issue? And we could do something like that, but what we will get is a card that is able to be reproduced easily and counterfeited easily. So I think that was on the, as we were talking about balancing the interest, there was an interest to try and move as quickly as possible, yet maintain the integrity that we thought was the intent of the legislation. So hopefully that makes sense.
There's not.
Thank you. When we go back and we talk about looking for funding, I noticed from my job in law enforcement, DOT has quite a bit of confiscated funds. I don't know what it is now, but last I knew it was millions. And they use that for all kinds of stuff. I mean, we use for equipment, we use for all kinds of things. So finding funds for this seems like it would be less hard to keep. There's lots of funds that have been confiscated, drugs itself, over the years. So it seems like there is a spot for some money, and I don't think there's money put in the bill. The DOT needed money to come up with the cards. It seems like it would be hard to find.
It really goes back to that concept of the Constitution and protected road use tax funds, so it has to be in some way related to the improvement or use of the highway system. This area we're starting to really tug at that. So
except for
I think we did locate funds that will adequately cover what needs to be done for the development.
Except for those dollars aren't tax insurance funds. Those are confiscated dollars from drug arrest. You stop a semi, it's got $500,000. They're able to confiscate that over some time, and then it goes into a different fund. So there's money there that has nothing to do with tax.
Well, I think that's the other thing. The relation that we did find the funds to use was the technology, which is actually appropriate description of what we're doing, or actually drawing from the sale of driver records as well.
I had a question regarding this. Do you guys have an estimate on what the cost of the programming is? What is the cost of the card?
Yeah. There were two separate questions. The cost, ultimately the cost of development for our card vendor to design and implement the card as a system. In other words, the programming allows us to say this is the type of card we're producing, have that pass through the factory process appropriately, is $115,000, which is higher than the estimate that they originally gave us, but originally when we got an estimate for the fiscal note that went along with this, if you remember, there were two separate cards, and the complicating factor became the addition of patient names on the back of the card for the primary caregiver is a non-standard field that can be programmed separately. So that's ultimately what drove the $150,000 price tag for the development and implementation. Once we go forward and start issuing cards, and the cost of the card is the same as the other cards. So it roughly comes out to around, let's see, $329 a card, plus mailing costs, and then plus the administrative costs to produce the cards. So for instance, if it's at a county treasurer's location, county treasurer receives $7 for every card that they issue. At our location, it actually comes out about the same. Administrative cost is around $7, so it's around $10 per card.
Then $329 or $3.29?
$3.29.
Who knew that medical cannabis was just another reason to raise gas?
Well, we're not necessarily advocating that.
Fair enough.
Thank you, Chairman Volkman. Just a question. I'm concerned about the timeliness of this, and I understand your concern about duplication and fraud with the cards, but I know when I get pulled over by our state troopers and local police, that all they got to do is call in, and they do. They double check my registration. Why can't you have a list of valid cards, and somebody gets pulled over, they present a card to an officer, and it's very simple. They go back to their car, and they check to see if that list is valid. I see that these cards only last for a year, so you have time to improve your system, but at the same time, there's a very limited number of Iowans that would be ready for this process. And the fact that they issue the cards on January 30th, the application process will begin at that point, so they're not going to be able to access this medicine till sometime after that. So what about that security, being able to be double checked and issue a card right now that maybe doesn't have all the bells and whistles, but certainly the Department of Transportation through our correctional officers around the state, police officers, would be able to verify that through a secure database.
Well, I actually think, truthfully, when we're having conversations about how you construct the system, that actually becomes a reason as to why we didn't need a separate card at all. And I would advocate that the driver's license identity is a piece of information, since this person is who they say they are. And then, what you're talking about is exactly correct. Once you identify the person, then sort of the cloud concept, officers through the Iowa network can link to information about that person. So, I think it is correct that you could work with ETS to build a communication concept that says, one, they already know who the person is because they've got their license, they can verify that through the system. Two, they can then see, do they in fact have the permission to carry the cannabis. So it is really the direction that we're going a lot of this. We got the approval to create a database, self-managed database through our portal for people to report their contact information, medical information, safety important to them. Important to them if they're in an accident, if they're seriously injured, that type of thing, or they're jealous for their family members. And it's really just a cloud concept. The card or the DL number keeps the officer to access the information, only the officer can access the information. So that concept is spread. I think where we're at right now is that the legislation specifically does require a card. We talked through that concept as well, but ultimately because of the way legislation is drafted, we usually have to issue a card.
Well, it does require a card, and I'm getting back to the point where it doesn't have to be the most secure card right now. That person, if they're identified through a driver's license and they're pulled over and maybe they have cloud problems and not accessing that limited list, they're pretty much had anyway. I don't understand how you couldn't get them after the fact. Maybe the officer let them go because they couldn't verify that. But they got their driver's license, they've got the information they need. Once they find out that this card maybe is falsified, wouldn't they be had anyway?
Ultimately, I would say yes, it makes it better connecting the information. And really, I think the area that phrases that concept is simply that the legislation seems to allow some moves for people that don't have an Iowa driver's license and an e-card. In particular, the primary caregiver can be a non-resident of the state, which is a new issue for us. And typically, we don't have that. We don't issue DLs or IDs and not a resident of the state.
Well, just one final comment. You don't have to respond. These families are going through living hell. And I think Iowa and its governmental agencies ought to work as diligently as possible. I think you certainly have the authority to issue a card that maybe isn't 100% secure, but would move this process forward. And I look at this as more of a bureaucratic mess. Somebody said the term shouldn't be used, but I think it is.
Representative Forrest.
Did the Department research other states have done in issuance of cards similar to this? And try to get ideas that maybe streamline the process a little easier?
I'm not.
I'm not aware of any other states doing that.
Most of the states passed this legislation at the same time we did. They've actually been asking us how we plan to do it. We've received comments from Pennsylvania, so we're doing the best we can, really. I mean, we've been talking to the families, we understand their plight, and I think we're putting forward a good faith effort to appease all sides of this.
But 22 states.
We immediately, upon signing the legislation, started working the process, drafting rules, working with the vendor, trying to work through the issues as quickly as possible. I do think, as was mentioned, following the rule process without pursuing for create its own timeline, and that is one of the issues.
The issue of the card, back when the legislation is the legislation. These departments are trying to implement it. And we talked about a card or not a card. Can't they just send them a letter? And the majority of the people working on this bill want a card. So we got a card. I think the idea to have DOT involved came from the governor's staff. Okay, they issue cards, because we talked about public safety issuing cards. We talked about the health department issuing cards. And we've got a big solution here, okay? And my frustration, a little bit of frustration, I mean, nobody at this table likes this delay, right? I mean, I think we'd all like to have sped this up. We decided no emergency rules. That would have helped. This card has taken some time. But I think the bias that this card has is that, as we think about this, we think about everybody as a criminal, right? That we've got to protect ourselves from people getting marijuana or cannabis. So we have to have this 24/7, 365 system with, we've got 100 families that need our help. But we've got to have this system that treats everybody like they're trying to break the law. My God, we're not going to break the law. We're going to have this system. Okay, so I think we need to think about, we're doing healthcare here. And these are patients and families, and that we, as we go forward, because it's obvious this bill needs work, that we put on our healthcare patient hat and set aside maybe next time we work on this the law enforcement lens that I think shows up in a lot of places here that has resulted in a bit of this delay. Okay. I appreciate the department's doing the best they can to get this card. They're working on a super secure card that you can check at 3 a.m. in western Iowa on I-80. Don't anticipate a lot of these families going to need that kind of, they're going to run into state patrol at 3 a.m. on western Iowa on I-80. That we need this kind of rigor in the system. But we have it. We're moving ahead with it. And the sooner we get it, the sooner we can get it done. My question: Can people apply before? Is there a way we can
allow people to apply for these cards before September 30th, or I'm sorry, January 30th of next year?
What we'll do, again, the January 30th date, just to clarify and be clear, is the date the administrative rules will become effective. It's not necessarily the date that we'll begin accepting the applications. What we will do closer to the date is understand better the vendor's timeline with DOT. If there is a short enough lag time, you don't want to leave people hanging for weeks or for months necessarily. It won't be months, but you get my point. Then I think we will make a decision on whether or not we feel that we can start accepting the applications in a timely manner that will also incorporate the time frame of the DOT will be able to issue the cards. So we will consider that option in an effort to keep things moving.
I do think that we can also be. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Jeff, sorry.
We can also make sure that the identification cards that needs to be issued or the licenses, whatever, can be done ahead of time too, so that they're prepared to have that information to the Department of Health before they make the application.
Which I think will be better. We have 2.1 million people in the state that already have a driver's license or ID card. And I wasn't aware of any parents talking about this that didn't have one already. I think for the most part that's not going to be the issue. It's just getting the system up and running. But I am comfortable with the concept of starting the process and say yes, you're eligible for a card. And then it's just a matter of communication saying now we're ready to issue, please come in and we'll get it started. The other thing I wanted to just follow up with regard to the comments about kind of how we got here comments. I was not involved in those conversations, but my understanding was that one of the reasons DOT came up was because although there's lots of places you could issue a card, there was a concept that we wanted to leverage our card production system, which includes having all of our locations and county locations as a point of access, as well as our central ability to manufacture and distribute cards, which then changed, which then shifts it from the concept of just making another card. That's part of what's driving, in addition to the integrity security issue, that's what's driving the DHE program, both our system and our vendor system to be able to do that.
And they're taking leads in law enforcement, to your point earlier.
Thank you. We're running up against the clock. Mark, do you have anything else, or Deborah or Kim?
I can briefly talk about 3 things that we would suggest you consider for 2015 if you want to do that. I guess glazing over the other slides, I was going to let you know that, about the webpage development. Now, the webpage, we sent an informational letter to the 148 licensed neurologists in Iowa to help them understand what's going on. And then we've been working on the development of the application for recommendation form. So we didn't play the hypothetical game because I think we're all going to learn about this together and we can work together to make the necessary improvements of the law to make it better for the families. The first thing so we really only have 3 things for you guys to consider. And the first is the primary caregiver turnover and the ease of the card issuance process. As someone stated before, you have to have the patient names have to go on the back of the primary caregiver's cards. I wasn't involved in the discussion on why that requirement was there, but we are sensitive to the fact, after talking with the families, that there is a lot of primary caregiver turnover. So it's something that we're going to be monitoring. We're not calling it a problem yet, but if a primary caregiver has to come and get a new card every time a patient changes, that could turn out to be cumbersome. But again, we're monitoring it. There's also a potential for duplication of treatment efforts by Iowa and out-of-state neurologists in Section 4 of the legislation that lays out the requirements for a written recommendation form. And the legislation allows, when they require 6 months of treatment from a neurologist, they allow it to be an out-of-state neurologist. However, in the next line, it says the neurologist, which implies the neurologist writing the written recommendation has also had to have tried alternative treatment options. So just looking at that and monitoring it, that may not be the best way. It may cause some duplication of treatment efforts. It's not necessarily anything we know about because in keeping with our mantra of staying out of the patient-doctor relationship, we won't see their treatment plans or anything of that nature, but it is something to consider. And then finally, a fee structure that Mark wanted to talk about that was not authorized for either agency because of the associated costs. So we have a minute for Mark to chime in there.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, I just want to back up the primary caregiver concept for just a second. So that concept of putting patient names on the back, we also had a discussion that it does create some privacy issues because the patient can't control what the primary caregiver does with the card gets lost. We now got their medical information, how it is available for distribution. But that point of having them maybe come multiple times during the year could probably soften this. If we at least shifted that part to the concept that who they are the primary caregiver could be managed more electronically in the cloud by DCH, something that can be checked and as it needs to. Then that can, the person will get a card and maintain a card, and as the patient names change, that can be maintained without coming in and out all the time. So that's just I think point where we probably stop the process a little bit. On the fee structure, then it goes back to what we're talking about. We have the estimate costs we're dealing with on an ongoing basis. The concept was one way or another, someone's going to have to pay the cost of business. It's not much different than what we have for the driver's licenses or IDs, which we set at $10 to make sure that the road use tax fund is not losing any money by issuing the card, because otherwise it needs to get paid out of the road use tax from the office or shift it to your Department of Public Health. I'm not sure where their budget is to be able to absorb those costs. So the concept of just looking at the same kind of fee structure we have for the driver's license or ID, just to cover the cost of the card without creating any revenue, might make sense long term for the health of the road use tax fund and just the cost of maintaining it.
Thank you. Kim?
I just had one more comment on the renewal process. Once we've identified and issued the very first card for this, our goal is to make it as easy as we can. On the Department of Transportation side, once we get the first card issued, we may be able to, once we have the approval by Department of Health to go ahead and issue a second one, it may be automatically sent out to them. Not that we see them. So we want to make that.
That's a great point.
Okay, thanks. Thank you for the recommendations, ALC. Kim, Deborah, Mark, thank you so much for all your work on this.
Thank you.
The next item on the agenda is right here from Dr. Josie. She's Clinical Associate Professor of Neurology at the University of Iowa, Carver College of Medicine at the University of Iowa College of Medicine Research Study. She's going to present on DVD. Good morning. Thanks for being here.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for allowing me to update you on cannabidiol in the control of refractory seizures. Hopefully, everybody has a bibliography of about 14 articles. And what I have been given the job to do is to update the group about the medical science behind cannabidiol to date and upcoming trials. To give a little bit of background, I finished my medical studies in Mumbai, which gives me the MBBS. After which I did my pediatric neurology at Cornell in New York. I completed the pediatric epilepsy fellowship in Wayne State University in Detroit. And then practiced for 7 years in Canada, which gave me the opportunity to use a lot of European medications which are not FDA approved in the use of epilepsy. I arrived to the University of Iowa in 2008, and since that time, I've been treating medically intractable epilepsy patients since that is my specialty. I diagnosed my first Dravet patient in 2002, and the Dravet syndrome is a classic example of medically intractable epilepsy. I think before starting, I would like to define some terms. And so, looking at what cannabidiol is, if one looks at the plant, cannabis has two strains. It is cannabis sativa and cannabis indica. The substances in the cannabis plant that work in the body are two main substances, THC, or tetrahydrocannabinol, and CBD, which is cannabidiol. Tetrahydrocannabinol is psychoactive. What I mean by psychoactive is that it gives you the high, and it causes the anxiety, the delusions that go with the high. CBD is the not a psychoactive component of the plant. In general, the strain cannabis sativa has more THC, and cannabis indica has more CBD in it. The other thing to remember is what's available out on the streets right now is almost pure THC. The other thing that is important to know about this plant is that depending on the temperature the plant is grown in, depending on the amount of sunlight the plant is exposed to, depending on the fertilizer, the amount of THC to CBD in the plant can change. So having said that, let me define medically intractable epilepsy. By definition, this is an epilepsy which has not responded to 2 or more medications in a child of any age. And so medically intractable epilepsy could be defined even in an infant. It does not require you to have a certain number of seizures per month. It requires you to have failed 2 or more effective medications. Having said that, let me also define a double-blind, randomized clinical trial. To date, there has been no double-blind, randomized clinical trial of sufficient strength in CBD. A double-blind trial is where I, as a doctor, don't know what the patient is getting. The patient does not know what the patient is getting. A randomized trial is one where just by a coin toss, a patient might get the active substance, the medicine, and/or the patient might get the exactly same smelling, tasting, looking substance, which is not active, also called a placebo. So in a double-blind, randomized trial, the patient, neither the doctor don't know what they're doing. And in a multi-center trial, to avoid confounders, the same process is repeated again and again across centers within a country or across countries. So now going back to the cannabidiol studies, I will refer to several articles in Physiology. When you look at the flagship of the International League Against Epilepsy, the journal Epilepsia, in June 2014, on their front page has CBD. And it details the various cannabinoids or substances that are in this cannabis plant, including one which is CBD. Several of the articles that I will reference to, for example, Article 1, Article 2, Article 7, are in this particular journal issue. What we know so far is that CBD has proven effective as an anticonvulsant, meaning it helps treat epilepsy or it helps treat seizures in the acute animal as well as human model of epilepsy. What I mean by acute is where seizures have just started. We don't know yet whether CBD is effective in a chronic human model of epilepsy. What we also know is that the cannabis plant, or tetrahydrocannabinol, can be anticonvulsant, but it can also be proconvulsant, whereas CBD is almost always anticonvulsant. So whenever you are dealing with a plant extract, it is very important to know what the THC to CBD ratio is of what you are getting. So going to the 7th reference of Edward Bond and Paige Phoebe. Paige Phoebe happens to be the mother of Charlotte Phoebe, who is very famous now because of the fact that she was on CNN and that unfortunately she has Dravet syndrome. The fortunate part is that she got CBD and her seizures went from several hundreds of seizures per week to perhaps 2 seizures per month. There is an article by Silvio, Teal, and Devonsky, which is the first in the bibliography, that makes the case for assessing cannabidiol in epilepsy. And it brings forth the data so far that we have available in the literature. So I shall link that to bibliography number 5 as well as number 4. To date, in the medical field, we refer to the Cochrane database, which is where multiple randomized clinical trials are assessed to see what are the real numbers. And today there are only 48 patients that are available to us to look at in the literature, which has been looked at in 2012 and once again in 2014 in the Cochrane review. Of those 48 patients, these 48 patients were given cannabidiol between 1979 and 1990. After 1990, there has been no randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial of CBD. Even among those 48 patients, the details of what were their baseline seizures like, what other medications were they taking, were those medications changed, what doses were they given, are not very transparent. And that's why the bottom line of that top-line database is that what we can say so far is that CBD does not give serious, life-threatening adverse effects to patients when used. However, when it comes to how much dose of CBD is effective, for what age would a certain dose be effective is really not known. Now compare that to the fact that over that same time frame, I have available to me between 15 or 20 anticonvulsant medications to use. And routinely, I tell my patients that you might have liver toxicity, you may have bone marrow toxicity, your EKG might change. Today, from what little or how much we know about CBD, there has not been any fatal liver toxicity or bone marrow toxicity or any fatal EKG changes that occur in these patients. People might say, what about the effect of cannabidiol in terms of its addictive properties or in terms of its psychotic properties? Interestingly enough, reference 3 is that of cannabidiol as a potential treatment for psychosis. It is actually felt that when somebody takes a plant extract, the bad effect of THC is negated by the good effect of CBD. In patients that have schizophrenia, the available medicines will treat the positive effects of hallucinations and delusions, but they don't help treat the negative effects that patients suffer from. And when these patients are given CBD, their negative symptoms actually do improve. CBD does not have addictive potential to the best of our knowledge, and that is once again brought forth through some of the articles that I referred to. So I think, all in all, what we do know in summary so far is that CBD has anticonvulsant properties that have been proven at the basic science level, in animal studies, and to a certain extent in human studies. However, this has not been replicated in large numbers in a randomized, double-blind clinical trial. What we also know so far is that THC is proconvulsant in some models, anticonvulsant in some other models, and THC is psychotropic. What we do know is that when you use plant extracts, there is no standardized method of making sure that your THC to CBD ratio is very low, which means what you're getting is pure CBD. Because the people that are growing the marijuana plants may not have a standardized method of growing it only under certain conditions. Which brings us then to what is out there. And this is the last reference 14, which talks about Epidiolex. GW Pharmaceutical is a UK-based company that has invested themselves in preparing pure cannabidiol since the 1960s or 70s. And what they have is a plant strain that they grow in a secret place, and they have perfected the art of making pure CBD. The hope is to try or to start a multi-center randomized double-blind study across not only multiple centers in the United States, but across the world. The University of Iowa Children's Hospital will be a study site with GW Pharmaceuticals relatively soon. So at this point, I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
Representative Rogers.
Thank you, Dr. Yosh, for being here. Very informative. A lot of questions. You said in your definition of intractable epilepsy, you used the word child. Can an adult have intractable?
Absolutely. Either a child or an adult.
So it does. What, in your opinion, why have we not had, and you need to answer this correctly, why have we not had any double-blind studies?
I think the biggest problem is the legal issues around obtaining cannabis extracts to do the studies.
Federal legal issues.
Correct.
In your opinion, I would assume that you would like to be able
That is true, and we will be a center at the UNC.
You say that is a for sure thing?
Yes.
And do you have an anticipated date that it will start?
I'm going to the investigators meeting right away from here. The meeting is tomorrow, and we'll know more details then.
How will it, the legislation that we passed and the potential Iowa study that we're doing going to affect what you're doing with the GW?
I don't think, see, the study is going to be extremely rigorous. The study is going to be restricted only to driving patients. And, I mean, as a parent, from my standpoint, right now, if I were to be told that my child is going to be involved in a study where I don't know if I get a placebo or I don't know if I get the study drug, and my child happens to have 40 seizures a day, and during the time that I am part of the study, I cannot change any of the medications. It would be difficult to maintain that driver. So therefore, understanding that, the company has extremely rigorous inclusion criteria for bringing in patients. So every patient actually that has Dravet or even has medically intractable epilepsy cannot be part of this. As a result of which, I think, I don't foresee the law interfering with that, because not every child is likely to be included in that study.
Do you have concerns about the product that some of these parents may be getting on the state source? Do you have concerns about?
Yes, I do. And the reason has been I'm asked the question as to how much will I give my child? My first question is what concentration of the oil do you have? And sometimes I'm told that such and such person told me to boil such and such in such and such fashion, and so there's a little bit of guesswork involved in how many milligrams of CBD you can deliver to the patient. So yes, I do have concerns.
Do you have any recommendations? What would you tell a parent?
So what I have told is what's available in the literature so far, that between 200 and 300 milligrams per day seems to be.
One last question. How many patients from Iowa do you anticipate within your study?
So,
are they all moving?
no, that's not correct. Actually, a lot of patients in the state of Iowa are doctored out of Iowa. And we will be recruiting patients from not just within Iowa, but from across the state that would want to participate in this study. I personally have about 6 or 7 patients that I have diagnosed during my time here. Not all of them will be part of the study, I know that. So it will be a small, this study is going to be part A, part B. The first part of the study will be to figure out the correct dose. The second part of the study will be then to use that effective dose. And so that it will depend which patients will go to which part of the different one will fit in.
I'm sorry, I have more questions. In our legislation, we charge 2 years of labs to do their own study in this legislation. Are you part of that, or is that something totally different that you?
No, I'm not part of it. I don't know that we are going to be doing any such thing. I didn't know to be honest.
Thank you. Representative Forbes.
Thank you. You discussed the levels of CBD and THC. In our legislation we passed recently, we were allowing up to 3% THC level. Are there any studies that show how much THC compared to CBD are required to get positive response to seizures?
I'm not aware. I'm sure there's some that I don't know.
And another concern of mine too is quality control in this process of making, because you've got different areas of the country that are manufacturing this, mostly Colorado, Charlotte, whatever. Is your study, is the company that's going to provide you with your product, is this the company out of Britain?
United Kingdom.
Okay, so you're pretty confident in the fact you're going to receive the study control groups, that you're going to be able to have a consistent
Yes, because actually if you go to their website, which is one of the URLs, they talk about how they have cloned their plants genetically. You obviously I don't know how they do this, but it is medication that we get. So it is pure CBD that they're making.
So that what you're gonna get from that doesn't have really any THC in it, or very low levels?
Correct, to the best of my knowledge.
Thank you, Representative Cressick.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Chair. And very informative, I'm sure you have more knowledge than many people in the entire world on this issue. I was amazed by it. I know that in Georgia, they had kind of a similar bill, but it was defeated. But the governor of that state has identified a Regents University, much like Iowa, to do a study on this. Are you familiar with what they're going to do with this study? And I do remember the bill specifically, if I'm correct, was that the University of Iowa was to collect information about what's going on around the world with this and share it back with the legislature. And I see some heads nodding over there. That was really the intent. It wasn't that you, the University of Iowa, is going to do a study specific to this. So can you just share a little bit about Georgia and what you know and what they're going to do there? Or maybe I'm asking somebody else or should?
Yeah, actually, I was aware about Georgia doing it this morning. Somebody else brought it up to me, but I didn't know details.
And now Minnesota is also moving forward with some studies and things like that.
So Minnesota is hoping to be part of the same GW study that the University of Iowa.
And it's my understanding this study in Georgia is with this group in Britain that you had mentioned.
I'm beginning to
GW, I think.
GW Pharmaceuticals. I know that the University of Chicago, the Children's Hospital, will be part of that study, as will Mayo Clinic, which is what you just mentioned, as will the University of Iowa and a few other centers. And once I go to the investigators meeting tomorrow, I will probably know which centers. So GW Pharmaceutical, on a compassionate basis, has provided CBD to at least 300 people or 300 children in the United States so far. And once again, although all this is anecdotal, because this is open label, none of those children has had any life-threatening side effects to our knowledge.
So are we going to get kind of, maybe I'm asking the wrong person, are we going to get that information to the legislature, so with the next session upcoming, so we can know how those 300 students dealt with this? Do you have that?
Yeah, it is actually common knowledge because it's available in the public domain, what GW has provided. And now, remember, all those patients are not Dravet. All patients do have interactive epilepsy, or they have epilepsies from a variety of problems. But those FDA open label uses are more on a compassionate basis. And it's not, although as a prescribing doctor, I do require to report back to FDA. All that they need to know is whether my patients have had adverse effects. So we will have known that.
Senator Snyder.
Thank you. Thanks for coming here today. I just had a couple of follow-up questions. I want to make sure I understand accurately what is going to be done at the University of Iowa. You mentioned that the Children's Hospital there will be a test site for GW Pharmaceuticals, and by test site, you mean you'll be conducting a double-blind randomized study?
Yes.
And GW Pharmaceuticals will be sending you all of the cannabidiol that you'll be using. They won't be growing it or replicating it at the University of Iowa.
No.
And you mentioned that the people who undergo the study at Iowa would include both Iowa and out-of-state patients.
That's correct.
Or residents. Okay. And are you aware of, you mentioned that you have some concerns about this product being produced in other states as not adequately or...
I think the concerns are not about the fact about the CBD, but the concerns are about the standardization, and I'm not privy to how the standardization process occurs. And so when somebody says...
Standardization meaning knowing what level of cannabidiol to use. Do you know of any states that do require some level of standardization or quality control or anything like that? I don't have any other questions.
Senator Wright.
Thank you for being here, Mr. Chairman. Can you convert for me, we are restricting the amount of cannabis that people can possess at 32 ounces. Can you convert that to 200 to 300 milligrams?
Yeah, and I think that's, as I was listening to this more closely, I don't know the concentration of what my patients get. And so, an example is somebody sent me, the other day, somebody sent me an email that had hemp oil in it. And it was a little bottle that one of the patients sent me that is happened to be legally available for $499. This little hemp oil thing had, it did give a concentration of how many milligrams of CBD would be in it, and then we could do it. But if I don't know the concentration, how much CBD is likely to be present per ml, I cannot then, and every person may have a different concentration of their bottle. I may not be able to, each person may be getting a different ml because it's a different grower or a different concentration of the get.
Okay. Yeah, that was kind of one of the things I'm wondering. 32 ounces, and unless we know the concentration, it's 32 ounces, a 1 week supply or a 2 month supply, we don't know.
Well, and by the same token, at this point, we think between 200 and 300 milligrams is what works for most patients. Could it be 450 milligrams or could it be 25 milligrams? That kind of study has been done.
Thank you. Is that per dose or you're talking about?
So what we've been, the general idea is that generally we don't want to maximize the dose any more than 15 milligrams.
So good question. So let me just say, the university's job is to filter all the research and come and tell us. They're not doing double blinds. And this pharmaceutical company's coming to Iowa to do a study. It's probably going to be years, right, in terms of the process of actually seeing that research come to hopefully some positive result where there will be people going to John Forbes' pharmacy to get this, right? So it's important, it's great, it's happening at the University of Iowa. We have this awesome expertise. The reports, I think, from the university are going to be about what other research is being done around the country. So by way of summary, CBD is a good anticonvulsant. We've got some test data to show that. The CBD does not have a high risk of causing brain damage or other kinds of super adverse effects. There are challenges about the dose and effectiveness. We don't know enough about that. What's the dose and its effectiveness? And it's not addictive. Okay, so those things. So, the choices that these families make, and there's a whole array of drugs, epilepsy drugs that are FDA approved, they've been tested, that are risky. So, it's not, as we talk about the uncertainty around CBD, we don't know exactly if this pharmacy, this dispensary in Denver is testing this rigorously. The parents have said, we're willing to take risks, because the risk of this CBD going off a little bit in either direction, it's not going to kill them. So it's kind of an interesting, so I just want to put that on the table as we talk about the level of concern about. We need to know more. The federal government needs to get it together on this issue, so researchers like Dr. Josie have access, that we gear this up, make this go faster in terms of the research. Senator Dodson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In fact, you touched the questions that I was going to ask, and Dr. Yoshi, I really appreciate your presentation. I think it's, in this bibliography, it's going to be very